My name is Kim Cutler. I am a journalist and reporter for TechCrunch. I've been covering the technology industry for many, many years back in Silicon Valley, where my family's been for several generations. I wanted to invite you all here today to Kinetic, which is an event about the future of transportation and mobility. And it's really an apt word in some sense because it's about motion and energy. And if you look at where we are today with the advent of ride sharing, with self-driving cars, we're on the precipice of some really, really major changes in transit that this country probably hasn't seen since like the mid-20th century. I actually remember the first time that I rode in a self-driving car, and I think it was like a year or two ago, and I visited this startup in the Soma district in San Francisco called Cruise, and they picked me up in the car, and you know, at first it was human-driven because city driving is a little bit too complex for autonomous vehicles right now, and then we got on the 101, which is the main large highway between San Francisco and where Silicon Valley is, and then they turned on the self-driving mode. And there was this kind of deliciously sort of ironic moment when we were driving in this car and it was like managing the curves and the changes on the road. And we passed this billboard from Lexus, which was, you know, like we passed this billboard from Lexus for the new line of cars that was coming out. And I don't know, I mean, how many people here watched Star Trek? Did people like the Next Generation? Do you guys remember the series of episodes where Captain Jean-Luc Picard gets captured by the Borg, and he gets kind of assimilated by this, you know, very android homogenous society. And they had this, you know, they had this saying with the Borg episode, which is "resistance is futile," and that was the slogan that was on the Lexus billboard as we were driving past it in a self-driving car. So, I mean, I don't know if that gives you a sense of the changes that are kind of coming. And when I think about cities and the future of autonomous vehicles, I mean, this is some major stuff that's going to happen. It's going to change land values in the urban core, land values in the exurban periphery. It's going to change the way that we maybe think about public transit and what public transit even is. And there are opportunities to either kind of correct, you know, the mistakes in terms of city design and metropolitan regional design that we made decades ago, or autonomous vehicles are maybe a chance to repeat them all over again, maybe in an even worse fashion. So there's a lot of things that we have to kind of consider as we're entering this new phase. And those are some of the things that we're going to discuss today. So before we get started, I wanted to thank a couple of the sponsors. There's the Civic Council of Greater Kansas City, MRI Global, Bernstein Rain, and the Mid-America Regional Council, and all of the community partners that are listed on the pamphlet. So we're going to start with a presentation from Bill Ford, who's our keynote speaker. You know, Ford Motor Company is obviously an iconic American company founded by an iconic American entrepreneur. We don't expect to have all of the answers and all of this sorted out in a single day or in a couple of hours, but at least we'll have a good place to get started from. So with that, I'd like to introduce Irv Hockaday, who actually served on the Ford board for 20 years, and he's the longtime president and CEO of Hallmark Cards. So I'd like to invite him out on stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm to introduce Bill Ford, and he and I go back a long way. In fact, we go back such a long way that he is probably nervous that I'm about to introduce him. He's probably hoping that I won't mention that I think the last time he was in Kansas City, he was speaking to the Garden Club of America, which shows the intellectual wheelbase for a guy that can go from tulips to Tauruses and beyond. But I want to introduce Bill with a story. It will be brief, but it is also true. It started in 2005 when the economy was tanking and the automotive industry was right in the middle of that. Chrysler and GM were headed to bankruptcy court with the assistance of the federal government, and Ford was trying to figure out how to win the path through that territory. Ford stock had drifted to $17.34, and it would soon land at $1.01. So now shift to the boardroom in Dearborn. And the board and Bill were discussing how to deal with this situation, whether bankruptcy was the only option facing Ford, which of course would eliminate the Ford family ownership in the company. And in that boardroom, Bill Ford said he was going to eliminate his own compensation. We eliminated the dividend, which affected the Ford family. And Bill said he would not reinstate his compensation, even if the board wanted him to, until such time as the company resumed the dividend. And then Bill Ford said something that I think is remarkable in the annals of corporate history. And he said to us, in a somewhat more genteel manner than I will summarize it, he said, you know, you directors, and I appreciate your service, but you come here 10 times a year and you tell me what's wrong with the company, what the risks are, and then you leave and you come back the next month and you repeat yourselves. And he said, the fact of the matter is I know all of that and I need help, and why don't you go to your directories with me and let's find someone to come in and help us get through the patch we now face. And I will give up the CEO title if we find the right individual. And if it's necessary to give up the chairmanship title, I will do that too. And then he said this, because I have a lot tied up in this company, but none of it is my ego. And so we got to work and we found Alan Mullally, and there followed a turnaround story that will endure for a long time to come. I tell you that story for two reasons. First, in the appropriate recognition that Alan Mullally got for what he did, which was truly seminal and in fact remarkable. Bill's role was less well perceived, but nonetheless important. And the other reason I tell you that story is because, as you know, today it is popular and appealing to demonize corporate CEOs and boardrooms. But occasionally there emerges from that criticism and drumbeat of criticism a counterpoint story. And that is the story of Bill Ford, and that is why it is truly my pleasure to introduce him now. Bill.
Thank you, Irv. That was an amazing introduction. And ever since Irv said he was going to introduce me, I've had panic attacks because in addition to being an amazing director, and I'll get into that in a minute, he's also our wittiest director we've ever had. And the thought of allowing him to introduce me with no filter terrified me. So that was actually very responsible, and I really appreciate it. Thank you, Irv. It's great to be here in Kansas City, and I want to thank the Mid-America Regional Council and the Kansas City Civic Council and the other sponsors for inviting me here today. I also want to acknowledge our dealers who are here with us and the UAW and thank both of them for all the great work they do for Ford and themselves in the community. Ford Motor Company has a really proud heritage here. We opened our first sales office in Kansas City in 1906 and built our first assembly plant outside of Michigan here in 1912. Today, our plant here is the largest manufacturing facility in the Ford world and one of the most technologically advanced. It's been building the best-selling F-150 truck since 1957, and it also now builds America's best-selling commercial van, the Transit. In 2013, we invested $1.1 billion and added 2,000 new jobs to the plant to meet the demand for these new vehicles. So now, we have about 7,800 employees working at our facilities here in Kansas City. And I visited the plant this morning and took the opportunity to thank our great team there for the outstanding job they're doing, and they've always done a great job. But what I also love is the volunteer work that they're doing in the community. So over the years, they have contributed millions of dollars of support to local charities. And in 2014, we launched a new initiative with our Ford dealers called Operation Better World and invested more than $600,000 in education, safety, and community programs. In addition to the wonderful history we share, Ford and Kansas City also have something else in common. We owe a great deal of thanks to Irv. And as a business leader and philanthropist, Irv has made tremendous contributions to this community for decades. And he also made amazing contributions to our board of directors. Now let me stop here and just say a few words about what a great director can do for a company. So Irv mentioned the dark days, the 05, 06, 07, and I've never lived through anything like that, and I hope I don't ever again. I used to lay at night staring at the ceiling saying, is the company going to go down on my watch? And in a time like that, when GM and Chrysler went bankrupt, when our ability to survive was anything but certain, there are many, many forces converging on you. You have lawyers, you have panicked shareholders, you have terrified employees, and potentially you have a board that's fractious and divided. But we had a lead director in Irv Hockaday that somehow managed to hold all that together. And he would say to me, and then later after we hired Alan, to Alan and me, you guys just concentrate on fixing the company. I'll take care of all this other stuff. And all this other stuff was unprecedented. We'd never considered bankruptcy ever. We'd never considered the kind of industrial action that we had to take. And it was wrenching and it was heartbreaking. And frankly, I hated every minute of it. But we got through it. And we did things the old-fashioned way. We paid back all of our debts. We had borrowed it was the biggest borrowing in corporate history. And we had to hock everything, including our family name, the blue oval we had to give to the creditors. And when we paid back all our debts, we got it all back, including our family name. And I was, and when Irv retired from our board, it was, for me, one of the most poignant moments because we were losing at Ford the best friend we'd ever had. So Irv, thank you again for everything you've done for us. So I'm incredibly proud of our past, but this afternoon what I'd like to focus on is the future. I want to talk about the revolution in mobility that will change the way we move, and Kim touched upon some of that in her remarks. But this dramatic transformation is actually already underway, but it's really going to take off in the next few years. The mobility revolution is going to affect all of us personally and many of us professionally. The way we move people and things is going to change dramatically in the next few years, but it won't happen by itself. It's up to us to make it happen and make sure that the changes are for the better. Before we head into the future, though, I want to talk briefly about the start of my career at Ford 37 years ago and my journey since then. And don't worry, I won't take you through the whole thing. But I've always believed that the purpose of every company is to make people's lives better. And in that regard, I've always been a lifelong environmentalist. And when I started at Ford, my environmental views weren't widely embraced, to say the least, by the auto industry. But over time, my views went from controversial to consensus. And today, with the help of new technology, we're making our vehicles cleaner and more fuel efficient. We're also cleaning up our plants and dramatically reducing water usage. We're substantially reducing, and I believe someday we'll eliminate, CO2 emissions. There's a lot to be proud of, and we've come a long way. But in recent years, even as the auto industry has become more environmentally friendly and sustainable, a new challenge was emerging. I began talking publicly about this at a TED Talk I gave 5 years ago. I described a world of growing population and prosperity with twice as many vehicles on the road as we have today. But it was a world with too many cars stuck in a global gridlock of endless traffic jams. And this would have serious consequences for our environment, our health, our economic progress, and our quality of life. To avoid this looming crisis of overcrowded roads, I said we needed smart cars that were integrated into an overall transportation system. A system that uses real-time data to tie all types of public and private transportation together. It was a shock for some people to hear the head of Ford Motor Company advocating for a major change in the way our industry has operated for more than 100 years. But the world I described 5 years ago is quickly becoming a reality. The smart mobility revolution has truly begun. The auto industry will see more degrees of change in the next 10 years than in the prior 100. In the next few years, our cars will be doing things you can hardly imagine today. Today's vehicles are already using wireless infotainment systems and assisted driving and parking technologies, all of which are building blocks for autonomous driving. And along with smarter cars, new forms of ownership and usage are emerging: car sharing, ride hailing, and more. And cities and local governments are also using new technologies to optimize the various forms of transportation that their citizens use. And to go along with smart cars, they're developing smart roads, smart public transportation, smart parking, and more. As our industry enters this new era of connected and smart mobility, Ford Motor Company is committed to making people's lives better by changing the way the world moves. We're rapidly becoming both an auto company and a mobility company. And last year, we launched what we call our Smart Mobility, our plan to be a leader in connectivity and mobility, and ultimately autonomous self-driving vehicles. Since then, we've progressed from experiments to implementation. Dramatic progress is being made, including a number of new projects and initiatives. And perhaps nothing is more dramatic than autonomous cars. Building on more than a decade of research, this year we're tripling our fleet of autonomous research vehicles, making our autonomous fleet the largest of all automakers. We've also been working with IBM on a program that uses real-time data to help people driving in cities make better transportation decisions, such as finding an open parking spot or avoiding a traffic jam. We launched an on-demand dynamic shuttle service for our employees working in Dearborn, Michigan that features smart ride-hailing technology. And right here in Kansas City, we've just announced that Ford will be the exclusive vehicle provider for a pilot program that will provide access to areas of the city that are not today easily reached by public transportation. The program is a collaboration between the Kansas City Area Transportation Authority and Bridge, a Boston-based company that's been described as the Uber of bus transportation. It will use 10 Ford Transit vans built at our plant here in Kansas City that will provide on-demand shuttles, which will provide greater access and mobility to people in the community. This is a great example of what I've been talking about and what needs to be done in more cities. I've been very impressed with the forward-thinking approach that you have here in Kansas City, not just with this program, but frankly, the very fact you're having this conference today. From the streetcars that you have, your new streetcar line downtown, to the green bike boxes that make it easier for bicyclists to get around in traffic, you guys are finding better and new ways to keep things moving. And that's what our Ford's mobility plan is, Smart Mobility Plan is all about. We think of cities as our customers. We want to help you find solutions to mobility challenges, and we want to help you lead the mobility revolution. So how big a change will this all make in our lives? Well, in historic terms, you can look back to when we switched from horses to cars over a century ago. The transition from conventional cars to smart cars will be just as dramatic as we move forward. In more contemporary terms, many of us can still remember when the only thing you could do with your phone was to talk to someone. Then in the last 2 decades, phones began to get smart, and today there are very few things that you can't do with your phone. And right now our vehicles are about where phones were not too long ago. Our vehicles are focused mainly on their primary function, moving people from point A to point B. And as they get smarter and more integrated into the overall transportation system, they'll do much more for us, including things we haven't even thought of yet. Imagine a car that drives you to a restaurant, drops you off, parks itself, and comes back to pick you up later when you call it. Or a car that reserves you a bicycle to ride that last mile into the city so that you can avoid traffic. Or that moonlights as a rental car, earning you money when you're not using it. As I said, this change won't happen by itself, and it can't be accomplished by an auto company all alone. Our leading thinkers and policy experts have to get involved and take up the challenge. Companies, entrepreneurs, and venture capitalists have to take advantage of this enormous business opportunity. The private and public sector should come together to shape policies that not only address immediate needs, but are also flexible enough to adapt to future requirements. We need investments, not only in new products, but also in infrastructure and education to build this better future. There's frankly a role for everyone. Smart cars will do wonderful things, but we shouldn't just add technology just for technology's sake. The fundamental question that we continue to have to ask is, will this make people's lives better? I'm more excited about the future than at any time in my career because I believe the resounding answer to that question will be yes. The mobility revolution is here, not in a distant city, in a faraway future, but right here, right now in Kansas City. And I encourage you to keep it going and to keep it moving forward because the best is yet to come. So thank you, and this ends my prepared remarks, and I guess I'd like to invite Kim to come back on stage, and she can fire any questions that she wants at me. So thank you very much. Thanks. Thanks. You need a microphone. Yep. Or you can share mine if you want to yell. Actually, the acoustics in this place are so amazing, you probably don't need a microphone.
So you talk about Ford becoming a mobility company in addition to being a car company. What does that mean, and what does that mean you have to do to the DNA and the culture and the organizational structure of Ford, the company itself?
To answer your first question, we don't know yet. We haven't dotted all the I's and crossed all the T's and figured out the entire future because it's changing so fast. And if you look at the disruption that's coming at us, it's coming at us from everywhere. The engine itself, it's going from gasoline to electrification, self-driving vehicles, ride sharing. Everything that we took for granted a few years ago is all changing. So we're in the process of figuring out what is our role in this? Where can we play? Where do we have to partner with other companies? And what should we leave alone? What should we just let other people do? We're sorting all that out. One of the things that's really interesting is we have some really, I think, awesome experiments taking place around the world. I'll give you one example. In India, we're sending our SUVs into rural areas and areas that haven't been well mapped. So these SUVs are mapping the area as they go out there. But then, once they get there, they're working with expectant mothers because often the facilities in these rural areas are non-existent or really subpar. And they're using the vehicle to transmit all the mothers' data back to the hospitals in the big city so that care can be recommended to that expectant mother in that location. that's just one example of what a connected vehicle can do. We have another one in rural Africa where we're working with NGOs there. Again, we're sending our SUVs out into the communities, and then, once again, mapping as we go along, and then figuring out what those communities need in terms of food, healthcare, water, and then we transmit it back, and then in many cases, we bring it back with our SUVs. So there's really, if you think about what's possible in this new world of connected vehicles, it's really quite remarkable. And if you look at it all through the lens of how do I make people's lives better, then it really, to me, that's incredibly inspiring.
What does it mean for, I mean, you know, traditionally the way you've made money as a car company is you make the cars and then you sell it, and that's the relationship that you have with your consumer. But when you're looking at a lot of these newer kind of consumer-facing transit startups like Uber and Lyft, I mean, the way that they're making money is selling rides and having this direct relationship with people using their app every day or multiple times a week. What kinds of things do you think you could add onto the top of the kind of initial car sale?
Well, look, our traditional business is going to continue on for as long as I can see it. So, and it's a great business, and we know it well. We do a very good job, and we have amazing partners in getting that done. But our traditional addressable market is about 2.3 trillion worldwide. It's triple that if you think of transportation as a service, and we get zero today of that market. So if you think of that as a business opportunity, it's fantastic. And what that really means is we're going to have to do both things. We're going to have to be a great car and truck company today and tomorrow, but we're also going to have another part of our company building a mobility business and participating in this new transportation as a service arena, which is, as I say, it's 3 times the size of our traditional market.
So when you talk about autonomous vehicle, I mean, you mentioned that that's the ultimate, really the ultimate breakthrough. What's kind of the timing for that? I mean, everyone kind of always dodges this question.
No, and I think they dodge it for a good reason. Couple answers there. So a few years ago, some of the technology companies were making bold predictions about when they would have them on the road. Well, unlike software, where you can be right about 60% of the time, 70% of the time, you know, you're driving a car, those are people's lives. And you can't fix it on the fly, or put a patch on it. I mean, you've got to get this thing right. So to answer your question, I think, you know, somebody will probably have some vehicles on the road within 4 years. But the question is, what environments will they be operating in? Will they be, you know, and so the way, you know, I sort of see it happening is it'll probably happen in a closed community first, where it's been well mapped, speeds are down, and you start to get experience with it. Because it really, what we really need is real-world experience, cars interacting with non-autonomous vehicles, interacting with other autonomous vehicles, pedestrians, bicyclists, and in all weather conditions. Because if you think about it, you know, so today, if you're driving today in Kansas City in an autonomous vehicle on a nice bluebird day like this, that's doable. Now think of Kansas City last winter when you were in, you know, whiteout snowstorms and couldn't see from here to the end of the stage. You know, all the radar and the LiDAR that we use, it becomes compromised. And so we have to be certain that these vehicles can be used in any situation. And that's why I think you'll see them start in certain locations, kind of self-defined first.
Yeah. What do you think about all the other, like all of these companies have slightly different strategies toward how they're rolling it out. Like Google is extremely conservative. They're building a very slow kind of city-friendly, you know, not more than 20 or 30 miles per hour vehicle. And then Tesla, they straight up just download the new software update.
Well, look, you know, far be it for me to say whose approach is right or wrong, but we're all headed down the same path. And you know, and if you think about it, if an autonomous vehicle can be running, you know, 20 hours of a day, you're going to need fewer vehicles in city centers, and that will free up the roads in many respects, and it'll be a great service opportunity for our dealers, frankly, to keep these things on the road. But it's, you know, unlike today's private vehicle, which is parked more than half the day. In fact, well more than half the day. So it'll be a shift in how vehicles are used too.
How do you decide, you know, when you just visited Silicon Valley in the last week, you met with tons of startups. There was a rumor that you guys were going to have a partnership with Google at CES. When you're looking at this whole array of companies and potential partners, how do you decide where you want to be and what you want to own in the stack? How much you want to do yourself versus just be one tiny layer that executes well on that?
Well, first of all, we can't do it all ourselves. I mean, and we're going to have to partner as we go through this new world in a way that we haven't before. So we're going to partner with technology companies, maybe with ride-sharing companies. I mean, the partnerships are almost endless when you think about, you know, mapping and all these things. One company can't and probably shouldn't do it all themselves. I mean, as big as we are, resources aren't infinite. And so part of what we're sorting out is who are our long-term partners? Where should we partner? Where do we want to go it alone? And where do we not want to go at all? But, you know, it's interesting. A lot of the companies looking at our industry from the outside think, well, that can't be that hard. But when they get here, they discover that the fairly prosaic parts of our business, supply chain management, parts inventory, all these things which aren't sexy and aren't always high tech, become something very real that they have to deal with. And they're starting to, I think, acknowledge the fact that we do all that pretty well. And so, and also technology. I mean, you know, the car is the biggest user of technology of any device out there. And so we have a lot of embedded technology as we start today. And I think that surprises a lot of the tech companies when they come in and actually start talking to us, how much we've already done. But we will, no question, we'll see partnerships emerge as we go through this.
In your talk, you kind of made this analogy between, you know, car kind of being where feature phones or where the mobile phone industry was like 5 to 10 years ago. I'm kind of wondering, like, what's the difference? What's going to be the key? What's going to be the difference between Ford becoming, say, like the Samsung of cars versus being the like Nokia or the Motorola?
We talk about that a lot. If we did nothing, let's say we just turned our back on this whole mobility arena and said, you know what? We are going to continue just to be a car and truck company. I think in 10 years, we would end up being a low-margin assembler of other people's technology. As you say, the handset. And that's not where we want to be. And frankly, that's not where we should be. So we need to play in this new arena. And it's really hard, because if you think of most big companies don't reinvent themselves very well. And there are a lot of reasons for that. A lot of people are tied, you know, to the old business model and don't want to hear about anything new. Sometimes it's not well communicated within the company in terms of why you're doing it and what the opportunity is. Sometimes the companies are just too bureaucratic to pivot quickly and to take advantage of new opportunities. All these things we spend a lot of time talking about. The one thing that gives me a lot of comfort when I think about our ability to pull this off is there is no dissension on our management team, none. And it's interesting because when I think about my environmental journey at the company, for most of those years, there was tremendous dissension within the company. People saying, well, this is all BS and it's all going to go away and you know, this whole environmental thing is just going to add costs and there's no benefit to it, blah, 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 blah. We didn't have 5 minutes of those kind of discussions within our management team because everybody can see the way this world is shaping around us. That's a huge advantage. And the other thing is we're spending a lot of time communicating within the company why we're doing this, what it looks like, and frankly, it's not either or. It's not either be a car company or be a mobility company. We have to do both, and we have to do both in a way that enhances both of them. And they're very synergistic because as you add new technology here, it flows right back into the core business in a way that enhances the core business. So, you know, I think in the past, some companies have this real tearing apart of their company. You're either in this world or you're in this world.
Is there a company that you look up to in this regard that's made this type of transition?
In our industry, no, because it's just starting.
Yeah.
And if you look at other companies, you know, I mean, IBM, who we work with, you know, they've been in a very dynamic, crazy, disruptive world for, what, 15 years, whatever, 10, 15 years. And maybe they haven't gotten it all right, but they've really reinvented themselves on the fly and continue to do that. So, you know, and there are other companies that do it, but it's hard because you can also point to companies, big companies, that haven't been able to do it, and the new technology just left them by the wayside.
I'm curious what you thought of GM's investment in Lyft.
Well, it's hard to know because, you know, I don't know what their corporate strategy is. Lyft is a very good company, and you know, I know them well, and I know their management team well. It really depends, I suppose, longer term what GM hopes to get out of it and how they hope to partner with Lyft in what regard. That's not clear yet, and it probably won't be clear for a while. So it's hard for me to really opine on that, other than to say I think Lyft's a very good company.
Yeah. And beyond Bridge, I mean, would you ever consider a major partnership with, you know, a Lyft or an Uber? I mean, Uber seems like they want to do everything themselves.
Well, look, you know, a lot of companies in our industry and the new disruptive companies, they all have a point of view. But it's clear that, you know, all of us need to work at some level collaboratively because whether it's on the technology, whether it's on the customer experience, it's really hard, whether it's building the vehicles. Yeah. No one company is going to do it all, that's for sure.
When you, I visited Detroit for the first time last summer. It was a really interesting experience, and I'm kind of wondering what you think the long-term relationship between the two regions is going to be.
The two, Kansas City and Detroit?
Sorry, Detroit and Silicon Valley.
Oh.
I was thinking, sorry.
Well, as I said, we already have a good one.
I will
Kansas
ask you
City
a Kansas
Detroit,
City.
But,
I will ask a Kansas City question.
I do think it's interesting. The worlds are coming together. So Irv will recall this. In 2007, I went to my board and said I'd like to form a venture capital firm that invests in mobility. And by the way, no one even knows what that term means. And so I did. And the worlds couldn't have been further apart. Today, it's really hard to know where one begins and one ends. And one proof point is the Consumer Electronics Show and the Detroit Auto Show. They're less than a week apart. They used to be totally different worlds. Now, we're trying to figure out how do we break news at both places less than a week apart, because they've come together so much that we're there in full force at Consumer Electronics, and obviously we're there in full force at the Detroit Auto Show. The worlds are coming together very, very quickly. In the world of Silicon Valley and Detroit, the one thing that I think Silicon Valley misses is in Detroit, we make things. And we make things well. We would say we make software. We don't make the hardware per se. But we do the hardware, and people, you need hardware. Yeah. Kansas City makes hardware, and you know, and you do need to marry the two. Yeah. And so we have more trained engineers in Michigan than any state. And so, you know, when people are looking for place to invest, you mentioned Detroit. Just a sidebar, it's amazing what's happening in our city. You know,
I know. I mean, the downtown area. I mean,
it's great. It's really remarkable. In Kansas City, I mean, you guys never, fortunately for you, fell to the depths that we fell in Detroit. And you've always had tremendous civic pride and done amazing things to keep your downtown healthy. But even Kansas City now is becoming more of a magnet for young people from your suburbs, and that's happening in Detroit now in a huge way. In fact, all the places to live are sold out. Young people are desperate to move in; they can't find a place.
Interesting.
Yeah, which is great. It's actually a nice problem.
So let's come back to Kansas City. You know, we're looking at. You said a car, like some of these cars might be available within, you know, in 4 years from other, you know, providers. Or what do you think a metropolitan region? What should cities do to plan for this? Well,
I mean, first of all, I said, you know, earlier, the fact that you guys are even having this conference is enormous, because I can tell you most cities, and not just cities, it's cities, counties, and states. My impression is you guys all work really well together, and I'm sure you're snickering and saying it's not that easy. But relative to other regions, I think you guys do a really good job. And that alone is a huge step up. And the fact that you're thinking about the future, what kind of infrastructure are we going to need? What kind of investments are we going to need? And we would like to have the dialogue with you because it is a symbiotic relationship. Depending upon what kind of infrastructure you guys are going to develop will largely drive the kind of investments that we make in the software and in the product, and then vice versa. So, one of the things that I would encourage is a really strong dialogue between the OEMs and the municipalities. I think it's really important, and I think this region gets that.
So in your earlier remarks, you talked about a lot of the environmental concerns that you've kind of driven through the company's culture over the last couple of decades. What do you think is, given those values, what do you think is a better way of implementing, the ride sharing or the self-driving cars that are coming? Is it something, you mentioned leasing out cars, so that sounded like you kind of were anticipating like an individually owned model?
Well, there will be all kinds of models.
Yeah.
That's the thing. We're going to live in a world where every model will exist. You'll have individual ownership, you'll have, but even those cars that are individually owned, they may be part of a pool which can earn the owner income as they're used by other people. But that will be totally up to the owner themselves whether they'd like to do that or not. And particularly, if you think of cities and how expensive it is to park a car in a city, the fact that it's sitting in a parking spot for 8-10 hours a day, does it have to? Maybe that car should be part of a pool that's being used and earning income for the owner rather than sitting there. So there are lots of different models that we're going to be living with and experimenting with as we go forward. That's the other thing. Not everything's going to work. And that's one of the things we talk a lot about with Inside Ford is failure. Because how do you handle failure in a world that requires experimentation? And I can tell you that not so long ago, the old Ford, if you failed, people were, you looked for the villain, and then things didn't go so well for that person. Well, if that's the case, then we'll kill innovation, absolutely kill it. What we need to do as a company is to say, okay, this didn't work. Why didn't it work? What can we learn from it? And what can we take forward to the next project? And if we do that, time and time again, we will encourage innovation, and we will encourage people to take chances. And that's a cultural shift, which is, I think, hard for most OEMs. But having said that, most employees love that shift. So it's really not a tough sell. It's really getting upper management to behave that way.
What if we go from an individually owned model to the fleet model? Like Uber has, I've talked to Uber many times. They want to render, individual car ownership obsolete, right? So if you've got another company running a fleet.
No, I get it. And, it's easy to make bold statements. But, the fact is we're going to be living in a world of individual car ownership for the rest of my lifetime. Mm-hmm. Now, will the proportion change? Sure. Particularly in city driving. But I actually think, what will end up happening is city driving will change fairly rapidly now.
Yeah.
But suburban and rural driving won't probably change much at all, other than a lot of the technologies will actually go into those vehicles and enable. But so, we're going to live in a bifurcated world for some time, and nothing is going to eliminate anything else. But that's a hard reality for a lot of companies because it's hard to embrace multiple things at once. But we're going to have to. We at Ford are going to have to, and society is going to have to, because there will be so many more options available to individuals as they think about their transportation needs.
One thing I wanted to ask about, so before we were touching on, again, some of the environmental concerns, how does the crash in oil prices affect your ambitions around electric vehicles and emissions-free?
Well, I tell you what, it's not making it any easier. Yeah. Because, look, here's the reality. We've got these federal standards that are going up and going up dramatically. And part of our, embedded philosophy, and I'm sure for many of the other OEMs, is we have to have a certain level of electrification to hit those numbers. Yeah. Well, the reality is, with gasoline where it is, people are doing the math and saying, I think I'll buy a conventional engine that, and A, because I know the technology, B, I know I can fill up, and I don't have range anxiety and all these other things. So on the one hand, it's really been good for us because it's enabling car and truck sales in a very healthy manner. On the other hand, we do have this potential disconnect coming roaring at us, which is what these standards are and coming at us in the future versus what individual customers are wanting to buy. And the other thing, the way I would put it is, the one thing that really hurts our car and truck sales, and I think our dealers here certainly know this as well as I do, is uncertainty. When you have, and we haven't had gyrations recently, but when you have big gyrations in oil and gas prices, it paralyzes our customers because they don't know what to buy. And the trade-in values of their vehicles do this too, based upon what they're currently driving. So uncertainty is the worst thing for our industry. We can adjust to a lot of different ambient levels of pricing if it's relatively stable and relatively predictable. We did see in the past, right around $4 a gallon, and there's nothing magic about 4, but that seemed to be where it was, where customers would start to shift their behavior fairly dramatically. At least that was our experience in the past. But what really shifts their behavior is uncertainty. Having it this low, I'm not sure it's that healthy for the overall economy, frankly. I mean, that's what we're balancing. It's good for the individual pocketbook, and so. And as we future out, but one thing, and Irv will remember this, every time we future oil prices, we're always wrong, always wrong. And I'll never forget, I had one of the great, two of the supposedly leading oil consultants come into my offices about 7 or 8 years ago, saying, I can guarantee you in the next 10 years, the oil won't go above $40 dollars per barrel. Within 6 months, it was 110. And with our product cycles, trying to plan on that, it's very difficult. Our industry, and I think society in general, is very poor at prognosticating where oil prices are going.
Yeah. Speaking of more prognostication,
yes.
I'm curious about vehicle design and the formats and passenger seating if we're expecting self-driving cars and ride-sharing. I mean, the classic car is built around the nuclear family, 5 seats, or the minivan, which is a little bit larger. But, I've heard everything from we're going to have one-person pods to we should have self-driving buses that have at least 10 seats. And I'm sure there will be a variety.
We'll actually need all of that.
Yeah.
I mean, I think one of the things for sure is that, even our what we launched here with Bridge in Kansas City, where we have 10 passenger transit buses, because those will, by definition, it's sort of in lieu of mass transit. You need to put as many people in as you can to get them around. And so you will have everything in terms of design. One of the big, though, issues is at what point do you no longer have a driver's seat in a car? Because I think for at least the first generation of autonomy, you're going to have the driver facing forward with controls available. Yeah. In time, does it become club seating where you're actually turned and facing the back seat? That will be interesting.
Getting back to the planning question, what does this all do to our conception of public transit and mass transit and shared transit?
I think it could really help public transit and shared. I mean, look, we need better public transit around the world and in our major cities to enable things. Because look, if we don't get this right, then these traffic jams we're seeing today, if you just do the math, we're going from 7 billion people on the planet to 9 billion. Yeah. And we could double or actually quintuple the number of vehicles on the road between now and mid-century. That will be the most horrific traffic jam that we've ever seen. And it ceases at some point to be an inconvenience, and it becomes a human rights issue. If you can't move health care and food around city centers, and in places like Kansas City, that seems like a stretch to say that. Parts of the world, parts of Asia certainly already, you've got gridlock and things just don't move today, and you start packing more people and more cars into that equation, and at a certain point, nothing's going to move. So we've got to free this up, and we've got to have great public transport, and we've got to have ultimately everything on a single network. Everything from pedestrians to bicycles to taxis to subways, individual cars, all have to be talking to each other. And, you know, and it's going to be to the point where if you're in downtown Delhi and you want to get outside the city to a soccer stadium, you should be able to ask your smartphone, okay, I want to get there. Your phone should then ask you, do I want the cheapest way or the quickest way? And then you have a multimodal approach depending on how you answer that. It could be a combination of a bike, a subway, a taxi, and then walk the last mile. But to enable all that, because right now there are a lot of apps for individual pieces of transportation. We have to get to the point where everything's on one network, and so you have a multimodal approach. And that's what we're working on at Ford, is how do we link all of this together so that a customer can get from point A to point B in a pretty agnostic fashion based upon the best way to get there.
If autonomous vehicles are coming so soon, I mean, should cities or public leaders think about having public fleets of vehicles?
Sure.
Or should they just let Uber or
Well, that's
whatever?
up to them. I mean, I think, you know, who owns them? That's an interesting question. Who does own an autonomous vehicle? But I mean, that's something that needs to be sorted out in terms of insurance and all that. Because if there's no driver, anyway. But I think the question is, it could be anything, and we don't know. It will develop organically, and I have no idea ultimately what the split is going to be between the ownership of the vehicles.
Okay, cool. I think that's all the time we have for questions, so I want to thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Kim. Thank you very much, and thank you all for having me. This is great. Thanks. Thanks.
So now we're going to have a panel. I don't know if everyone is here. They could come up on stage. So first we have Nicole Dupuis, and she's from the National League of Cities. And we have Steve Miller, who's the chair of Missouri Highways and the Transportation Commission. Then we have Joe Reardon, who's the president and CEO of the Kansas City Area Transportation. And last we have Chris Gearhart, who is the director of Transportation Hydrogen System Center at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory. So I kind of wanted to start off with a quick lightning round. We could start with you, Nicole.
Sure.
Just any general thoughts or ideas about what Bill's speech was about in our discussion afterwards?
Sure. Well, I think the watchword really was opportunity. We think of transportation a lot as being a utility, which it certainly is, but I think that what's lost is the unlocked opportunity in transportation. There's economic opportunity, there's social opportunity, and really what it comes down to for cities, but for everybody, is how we think about leveraging that and how we think about unlocking that. So,
do you have any thoughts?
You know, I've come at from the perspective of a public entity, Bill's, private enterprise, and I'm looking at the unique characteristics of a public enterprise and what we're faced with. And so to make it very local, for Missouri and for Kansas City, we're trying to figure out how we solve a current transportation crisis. So in Missouri, we see a decaying interstate system, and we have no ability to pay for it. Mm-hmm. But we know
we have the same in California.
I'm sorry?
It's the same in California.
Yeah. But what we know is that we're not going to rebuild this system as a system of the 1950s. Mm-hmm. It's going to be a system of the 21st century. And we also know the ways that we've paid for it in the past are not going to be the ways that we pay for it in the future. And we have this convergence of this huge tsunami wave of decaying infrastructure merging with this technology revolution that Bill talked about. And so as a DOT, we're trying to figure out how we manage those converging forces and what the future is going to look like. And in a minute, I'll talk to you about the challenges that I think that we face as a public entity as opposed to what private industry faces.
Yep.
Kim, thanks. For KCATA and I think for Kansas City, hearing Bill talk about tying together all kinds of modes of mobility in a way that can effectively allow someone to choose how and when to move from one point to the other was very impactful, particularly in Kansas City when we're just now beginning to think about at KCATA and maybe as a city about how we do multimodal. You know, we're not completely wed to one mode here as it stands today, and it provides us an opportunity to really start to figure out how we can tie modes together and how we can connect people together in a dynamic way. So to hear the leader of Ford talk about multimodal as part of a strategy seems like a great way to think about partnerships for us in Kansas City.
So I think for me, coming from the National Renewable Energy Lab, my perspective is really about, you know, how are we going to provide transportation without causing further damage to the environment, turning some of these things around. So it's always exciting for me to hear Mr. Ford talking about, you know, how the automotive company and the transportation industry can also be good stewards of sustainability. And I think these technologies offer a lot of opportunity. And when he talks about, you know, the fact that we need to hit these high CAFE standards for a lot of reasons, and we've got these technologies that provide so much in the way of mobility and safety and all the other aspects. They also, I think, provide a lot of opportunity for reducing CO2 emissions and energy consumption and petroleum consumption. And they are going to reduce the amount of energy it takes to move a person or a vehicle each unit distance. But all of these great mobility factors will potentially lead us to driving more miles than if you add on top of that the increased miles in countries outside of the United States. I think we have a real concern with no matter how efficient they are, the mileage is going to increase. We need to get them access to good renewable energy. And I think these same technologies that are distributing the mobility and mobility as a service, they're also going on in buildings and distributed energy production. So the distributed energy systems and the buildings, they're all talking to each other. They're all talking to the vehicles. So I'm really optimistic that in addition to changing the way the transportation system talks within itself, it'll change the way it talks to the rest of the infrastructures of the cities and with hopefully distributed renewable energy production. So I found it very exciting to hear him talk about these sustainability issues.
So I want to, oh, did you want to jump in? You okay? All right, I wanted to return to Nicole. So when we last met in Tennessee, the NLC, the National League of Cities, had just issued this report where it had studied all of the long-range transportation plans of dozens of American cities, and I think you found something like, it was like 6%?
Yeah, 6%.
Had mentioned self-driving cars, even though Bill, who was just on stage, said they might be fully on the road in about 4 years.
Right.
That seems like
sort of low, huh?
That seems like it's coming fast.
Yeah, and you know there is a lot of debate about when this technology will actually take hold, when it will be fully immersed, whether it'll be in 4 years or whether it'll be more like 10 years. But the
10
reality
years is still a short time.
It's
That's
a short period of time, and the reality is it's coming. The good news is that Kansas City is one of the transportation plans that did mention autonomous vehicles. So to my mind, that puts you all and your region in a really, really great place in that you're thinking of it, while your friends across the country maybe aren't, or at least according to their public-facing, you know, long-range transportation planning documents, they aren't. So, I mean, yeah, that's a problem, and that's something that I think shocked our members when we came out with this very low number.
Of the ones that are studying it, I mean, how are cities planning for it? Is it just a casual mention, or are there more deliberate?
For the most part, it's on their radar, right? And so, you know, there are a ton of implications as far as land use. We talked about that a little bit earlier. And, you know, the way we design our cities and the way we invest in infrastructure, that all kind of plays into this larger holistic discussion of how cities are going to prepare for this. And it's coming. So,
Steve, how are you preparing for this?
Yeah, so Kim, let me jump in there because I want to add another component to this. We have focused on all the exciting things going on with vehicle technology. You know, there's another side of this, is our vehicles have to run on something, and they run within systems. And infrastructure, we know how expensive it is for Ford to generate its automobiles, but if you look at the the revenue it takes to run our transportation systems, it's incredible.
Can you give us some background? I mean, how much unfunded, maintenance needs are there, and a little bit. I mean, I think we talked a little bit earlier that you
Sure.
love to drop in on the history of the system here and how it was built in the Eisenhower administration. And
Right. Well, let me. Every state in the nation is facing a funding crisis. We have our own that we're familiar with. As a nation, let me put it that way. We talked about Eisenhower. We talked about how we as a society have been defined by transportation. Bill talked well about the vehicular changes. It was the American people that were responsible for the invention of the steam engine, mass production of automobiles, airplanes, space travel. It has defined us as a people. And the corresponding infrastructure has also defined us as a nation. So Lincoln, in the middle of the Civil War in 1863, dreams of having a transcontinental railroad and spanning a continent that's 3,000 miles long, and announces it in the midst of a civil war where the nation's in jeopardy. This nation sees it through and in 6 years drives the golden spike. Eisenhower comes along in post-World War II, having seen how inadequate our infrastructure was compared to the Autobahns he saw in Germany, and has a dream of a 40,000-mile interstate system that builds roads differently than we had ever done before, and dreams of getting that done. It takes him 3 or 4 years in Congress, but in 1957, the start of that dream happens right here in Missouri. And the next presidency, John F. Kennedy, in the midst of losing the space race to the Russians, unable to even put someone up in orbit, makes this audacious plan that in 1961, before the end of the decade, we're going to put a man on the moon, and we accomplish it as a nation. Well, I see us on that kind of cusp right now of what are we going to do as a nation. I agree exactly with what Bill said, and when I talk about this, I use exactly what he did. I pull out my iPhone, and I ask people, do you have any idea how old an iPhone is when it was first introduced? Anybody know when an iPhone was first introduced? 2007, exactly right. Less than a decade ago, and look what it's done to our lives. Almost every aspect of my life and somehow goes through this. And it not only changes what I do in the convenience, but it changes the economic marketplace. It changes how I spend money. And societally and culturally, it's changing how I interact. It changes how I communicate with my daughters. I don't talk on the phone anymore. It's texting and Instagramming and imaging, and I can barely keep up with it. So it changes us as a society. Well, those things that Bill talked about, that's what's on the cusp right now for us in transportation. 20 years ago, all people saw in this was a telephone, a big clunky telephone, and never could conceive where we are today. I'm convinced 20 years from now, people will look back and say, can you believe in 2016 that people saw only concrete and asphalt? This allows me to exchange ideas and information. Our transportation vehicles and systems allow us to exchange goods and people. And we cannot begin to conceive what that's going to look 20 years from now, but we need to be out in the front part of this wave. So and I know I'm going on, but the first challenge, I think, is, particularly in a public entity, is how do we begin to educate a society so we can be prepared for these changes? How do we educate people so they're willing to invest in transportation? This is the analogy that I use, that I see coming, and those of us, if you're here, you see it coming. If you like the ocean, I live in Kansas City, but I do love the ocean. You go out and you look and you're wading in the ocean and you see a wave on the horizon. You can see it coming, but you don't know how big it is. You don't know when it's going to break. But you have a decision to make. You can either stand where you are, in which case that wave is going to come crashing over you, dunk you, slap you, and leave you behind. Or you can make the decision to start swimming as fast as you can so that you have some momentum when that wave comes, so that you can hit it on the cusp of the wave and you can ride it in. We face that challenge, I think, in the public realm of transportation, of whether we're going to be caught standing there as this new wave of change comes in, or if we're going to start paddling right now to be ready to carry the momentum. And when we talk about paddling in a public realm, that means moving our society to see investment in transportation as essential to economic development and prosperity.
I mean, I will say, coming from California and California being a post-automobile state, when I look at, the region that I come from, there's so many different options. There's fixed line transit, there's trains, there's subways, there's cars, there's an incredibly fragmented municipal governance system with 100 different cities. And I think there's a lot of confusion and paralysis of like, do we do high-speed rail? Do we put $10 billion more into BART because that's what our unfunded maintenance needs are? Do we build a Hyperloop? I mean, not that a Hyperloop, that would be very complicated to build in California, but like there's so many different options there and there's so many different choices on the horizon. It feels kind of confusing to decide to say make a massive investment in a fixed line project when self-driving cars could be coming in from this angle. Mm-hmm. And I'm just wondering how you look at that in your position.
Yeah, we don't know where it's going to go, but we know if history will tell us that what's going to be tried may fail. Now, Bill Ford made a very interesting point in the private realm. Is he said to all of us, how do we handle the risk of failure? Mm-hmm. Well, we actually do a pretty good job of that in private industry. We have research and development. No shareholder likes to suffer a loss when something fails, but generally we tolerate that. And that's what allows us to go forward with private enterprise. Now, we know that public entities must be an important partner in transportation. But in public entities, we have almost zero tolerance for risk. And so how do we move forward with finding this next generation of technology, of actually doing it at a DOT level the type of research and development that's necessary, where we can feel that we can take some public dollars, actually put them at risk, not be afraid to fail. And society, we're not very good at that right now, mm-hmm. Okay? And that's one of the reasons that it's difficult to move forward at a public level. But to avoid standing flat-footed in the ocean and getting slapped as this technology comes forward, we have to be more prepared as a society to tolerate risk and failure at a public level, because we're going to have to figure out a way to pilot some of these technologies. And you're exactly right, and Bill was right. We're going to fail at some of those. But if we don't try, we're going to be left behind.
So I'm curious from the three of you, when we talk about autonomous vehicles, they can clearly increase the capacity. They have the potential to increase the capacity of roads per hour, with the number of cars traveling on them per hour. In light of that, does that mean we should build more road infrastructure? At a panel that I did back in Tennessee with NLC, we had another transportation director from Chicago and DC who said, actually, no, we should not build any more roads because the capacity will just fill up and we'll just end up with the same amount of congestion or traffic anyway. So for cities looking at the increased efficiency from autonomous vehicles or some of these ride-sharing services, what's the strategy? Is it improve what we have, or is it add more roads or more lanes?
So I guess from my perspective, and Mr. Ford hinted at that a little bit, that if we're really looking at how to get more and more vehicles out there, we're really just going to slam into gridlock, and it's just a matter of is it now or is it 10 years later. So I think really as we look at these technologies, what we have to ask ourselves is how are they going to influence the evolution of the urban form, and what does it mean to live in the city? And the technology could go multiple directions, right? It could really remove the cost, personal costs associated with commuting, and so people just move into farther and farther out, and we have continue to have clogged up, but now clogged and autonomous highways moving into town. And I don't know that improves anything very much. But if they really enable a more livable, more desirable city centers, we have places where people actually want to come live in denser urban areas, then ideally, right, we can survive with the existing infrastructure we have and maybe just squeeze the lanes a little bit and trust that autonomy is there, but not really. So like you say, as history has always indicated, that if I really just build another lane out into the desert, I'm going to have more and more sprawl, and then people will build further out and further out. So I guess from my perspective, if it can focus inward, then we can use that increased capacity make the existing, it's not that we don't have to invest in the infrastructure, it's got to be maintained, but we don't have to use that precious space for more lanes and more highways. We can use those for other, and I guess I'm talking to a transportation crowd, so maybe I shouldn't say higher value uses, but really if you could think of something else to do with the space, that would be higher value.
What do you both think of that?
Joe, go ahead.
I don't know if I'll directly answer your question,
Okay.
Kim, but
That's fine.
I would say if you believe, as Bill Ford does, that disruption's coming to the way that we move, then the challenge for Kansas City is where do we fit into that as a city in the Midwest, a great city in the Midwest. And I think he gave us some nuggets of proof points for us. We build things here. We do very well at building things here, vehicles, Ford vehicles and others. And we also are a wonderful test bed. We are the place where all the seasons exist, where you can have the snowstorm and the day that's as hot as can be and 74 degrees in February tomorrow. All those things happen here, so I think we can become the test bed for mobility in a very unique kinds of Kansas City ways. We've been a test bed for so many things, and I think that provides us a niche in this space, and we're just the right size. If you want to test a vehicle in suburban areas, urban areas, older parts of a city, brand new parts of a city, snowstorm, rain, heat, Kansas City's your place. We ought to make our mark there. I think in many ways there's a chance to do that. Second thing is we're great at partnerships. We understand how to work together in Kansas City. We do it well every single day. And as I'm leaving KCATA, I've had a great run there. Some of our board members are here. Robbie Mackinnon's taking over. But in that entity, they are putting themselves in a place to be nimble enough to form a partnership, for instance, with Bridge, to figure out how you can experiment in Kansas City about moving people in a different way. So I'm really proud as I leave the position in just a couple weeks, Bridge in a partnership with KCAT will be on the streets of Kansas City. A couple, I think, of vehicles out front for you all to see. But it's going to be an amazing test bed for us in Kansas City to experiment with a new way of mobility to answer a real need, by the way. I mean, only 18% of jobs are effectively connected by public transit in Kansas City today. If we're able to be nimble enough, at KCATA, obviously so, but as a city, we can start to experiment uniquely Kansas City ways on addressing those kinds of issues and moving us forward as a great city and continuing to build on economic development. Those opportunities exist in this mobility space, I think, for Kansas City in a way that's unique to us. And I think a key to it is to be nimble, to get more experimental relative to the way that governments, all levels of government work, and then to form really good public, private, and other partnerships to make it happen.
And let me follow on that, because this is a great relationship between KCATA, which handles the local transportation, versus the Missouri Department of Transportation that's charged with connecting communities. So we have that shared relationship. So you asked about what are we going to be doing in the future and just building more highways. It is clear that we cannot continue to build out transportation as we've done in the past. In Missouri, in the last 100 years, we have built out 34,000 miles of roads and over 10,000 bridges. We have the 7th largest transportation system in the country, and we're about middle of the pack on both our size and our population. We've done a great job of building it out. But what we found is it's sexy to build it out, and it's no fun to take care of it.
What's your maintenance budget every year? I think one of your staff members told me it was something. It's like.
Yeah, I mean, our overall budget is about $2.1 billion, and we wouldn't exactly separate maintenance out like that. We're always having to rebuild some of our roads, but it's a large portion of it. Let me put it this way: is right now our director Patrick McKenna, who's here, he talks about asset management or asset preservation. So we have a replacement value in excess of $100 billion. And I said, we've done a great job as Missourians in investing in those assets, just as we might in our own homes. But now we're not bringing in enough revenue to even care for it. So it would be as if the most significant investment in my life is my home. It would be as if I bought the home, but now I've stopped repairing the roof. I'm not taking care of the foundation. The plumbing, the HVAC, the electrical aren't working properly. At the same time, I feel this pressure that some people want to, the people in my family want to add on the family room. and I haven't even been taking care of it. So it's clear we just can't continue to grow. We're going to have to be a lot more strategic in how we invest in transportation. I think some of that comes back to what we heard here with Joe and also with Bill Ford. We're going to look at more varieties of transportation, and I particularly see that opportunity. You know, we've talked primarily in the passenger realm, but here one of the great opportunities in this region is freight. And we have to be smarter about how we do that. So I tell people, you know, we stand at the convergence of one of the great river systems of the world, the Missouri, the Mississippi. It is the greatest river system on this continent and one of the best in the world. It's incredibly underutilized, and Kansas City is incredibly underutilized. And we know the efficiencies we can get by transporting bulk materials by barge. We've got to be smarter about that. We have the second largest rail center in Kansas City, the third largest in St. Louis. We've got to be smarter about how we use those rail resources. And then, of course, with respect to truck traffic, we have 8 states that border us. We truly are the heart of America. 8 neighboring states. We sit geographically in the center of the nation. The Panama Canal is opening up. Things will be coming up the Mississippi River, and we've got to be smart about how we preserve a transportation system that gets the right balance between truck, rail, and barge. But we're fortunate, and Kansas City is right at the heart of that. But we have to be proactive, start investing in it and marketing ourselves, because prosperity follows the freight. We have a great opportunity here, and that's how we're going to manage it, not by just building more and more roads, but by being smarter about how we do it.
So, I mean, it's clear from what you're saying that gas and fuel taxes are obviously not a sufficient revenue source for maintaining all of these roads, which is the same where I'm from. There's been discussion of different structures. I mean, people have casually talked about like vehicle miles traveled or
right.
something like that, but I like they're testing with floaters, at least in our state. I think people find the tracking a bit creepy. So I'm just, it's obvious that you can't rely on gas taxes. How do you get to a structure? What are some of the options that might work for financing all of this infrastructure?
Okay, I'm glad you asked. So I mentioned to you before that we saw this crisis coming of how do we replace our interstates to start with, and we have no revenue source. And so one of the things that we did last June, actually here in Kansas City, we launched an initiative called The Road to Tomorrow. And what we did is we looked around and we said, well, what assets do we have? Well, we have a great strategic location in the country. We've got I-70, which is already environmentally cleared and is ready for construction. And we've got good, talented people, both our private engineering firms and our contractors, but also the people within MoDOT. So what we said is, let's get smart about this. And we're going to take the 200 miles between essentially Independence, Missouri on the west and Wentzville on the east. And we're going to announce that we're going to offer those 200 miles up to the nation and to the world to be the incubator or the laboratory where we are going to experiment with what ought to be the next generation of technology. But, going back to your question, with a twist. And that is, how can we find, just as I did in my iPhone, how can I find new technology that's going to derive new economic resources? This is so powerful, not just because of the neat things it does, but because of the commerce and exchange that occurs on it. It wouldn't be nearly the tool. We need to figure out how do we do that with roads. So what we did, we announced the Road to Tomorrow. We put out the invitation, and we have, over the last 9 months, invited really the world to submit those things. And I can tell you, the latest totals is we've had 300 different submissions come in from around the country and the world.
Can you share any interesting ones or wacky ones or?
Sure. I'll share it this way, is that we found as they came in that they fell into maybe 8 different buckets. So let me share those buckets, and I'll give you some quick examples. This would kind of be the parallel to what Bill Ford did with some of the neat things out there with vehicles. So one is the whole idea of smart pavement. So right now, when we construct a road, we do what we call cast in place. That is, we go out and we put together forms, or you lay down machines, and we actually build the roads and bring all the materials and all the workers out to the roads to build it in place. But the way we build it in the future may be that we do it in a factory. So we do cast in place panels that might be 8 feet long, 13 feet wide, and that they would be done in a controlled environment where we would get better high quality, better production, and we would take them out and we would snap them together literally in place. Great safety advantages because we may be able to construct the road faster. But the other thing we would do with this smart type of pavement is we might embed in that sensors that could tell us where a pothole was going to develop before it did, the ability to melt snow on there so we don't plow it anymore.
That's cool.
We might put an enhanced Wi-Fi. So, you know, we may have smart cars, but they may need to also pair with smart pavement to interact. So we would have Wi-Fi, enhanced Wi-Fi that would go through those. And electrical vehicles, we would have electrical energy so that electrical vehicles could be self-charging as they go down the road. And where do we get the revenue? We charge a subscription, right? So whoever thought that we would pay for water that used to be free, or pay for television that used to be free? Well, now there may be a new service where we would pay for a subscription that would provide us all those advantages that I just talked about. So that's one example. Another example might be energy generation. So right now we're looking at companies that are looking at placing solar panels on our roads that would withstand 80,000-pound vehicles and would generate electricity that could be used and sold to cooperatives. Will it work? We don't know, but we're investigating it. Or how about wind energy, small windmills that might generate enhanced safety features on our roads? That would be the second bucket. A third bucket might be, you know, we've talked about the next generation of highways. Well, guess what? We need the next generation of cellular systems. When we built out our current cellular systems, we were dealing only with telephones. Now we have this tremendous amount of data that we're trying to manage, and we don't have a system that keeps up with it. You know, we used to build giant cell towers, and we would negotiate contracts one-off with community centers and churches, et cetera. Well, maybe the next generation of cell service is done with the largest landowners in each state that have an interconnected web of real estate that you can negotiate one contract, and you can put a cellular generation that might be the size of a small wastebasket at 1,000-foot intervals throughout a highway system, and now you have a very robust cellular system. And guess what? You charge royalties or fees for doing that. You generate revenue that can be put on the highways. We have kind of fifth bucket would be our freight solutions. So right now there's technology out there where we have the ability to link our semi-trailers using Bluetooth technology. So they still have drivers in them, but it allows them, the name of the company is Peloton Trucking, and they call it a Peloton because just like bikers that bunch together to increase efficiency and lower wind drag, so you would have trucks that would be linked with Bluetooth technology, controlled acceleration, deceleration, and realize efficiencies. And you might there might be a fee charged to run those technologies on the road. The other great thing that we see in life that we don't take advantage of on our roadways right now, advertising. It's everywhere, right? But there's no advertising that generates any revenue to our DOTs going forward. So what happens if we had a subscription-based service where those people that would travel on our roads might be taking advertising electronically into their vehicles, but here would be the twist. Instead of just the static advertising that we have now, where you would have convenience stores that would be giving you up-to-date cost information, discounts, et cetera. You know, pull in here and we're going to bid for your business. You know, that's all out there. We can see what happens on the internet. That internet technology that we see right now where you get on Amazon or you get on these other things, you compete for price. Maybe that's what happens on our roads, and maybe that's a subscription service that might be sold. We talked about the sixth bucket, which was our innovative funding, vehicle miles traveled. We have the technology now to do a vehicle miles traveled, and that is where we would track where people go in their cars and charge exactly for what you use. As a society, we're not ready for it, given the concerns about privacy. But the reality is, right now, you know, our cell phone carrier knows exactly what we're doing. The people in our credit card companies are gathering information. They have profiles that can describe every one of us, and we're going to have to be more comfortable that one of the things with advancing technology is some loss of privacy, and this may be a way that we're going to have to pay in the future.
It's so easy for consumer technology companies to convince us to give away all our data, but when it's the government.
Yeah, and here's the crazy thing is that there are absolutely very few controls over private enterprise when they gather your information. Yeah. When the government gathers it, there's all kinds of controls. There's the Freedom of Information Act that requires complete transparency in government. But again, these are societal changes where we're going to have to figure out what works in society. And then on the final buckets, you know, we have the whole horizon of safety. You know, we have to do better. And it was interesting listening to Bill. You know, we have over 30,000 people a year that die on our roads. In Missouri, we had, you know, over 850 this year. And it's funny, as a society, we've become just absolutely used to that. We have people, as many people die on a road as almost died in the Vietnam War, and we've managed to tolerate that and accept that as a risk of mobility. Well, technology has the ability to dramatically reduce that. Autonomous vehicles have the ability to do that. So how will we adjust that, and how do we find those safety innovations? And then finally, my last bucket is what you talked about, those crazy, wacky things out there like the Hyperloop. Okay, and so for those of you that don't know the Hyperloop essentially functions much like the pneumatic tubes when you go into your bank, and you put the little thing in, you put your money in, and it sucks it. Well, the idea is that you build a Hyperloop that essentially uses that kind of vacuum to whisk people at 700 miles along.
They're doing a test track in Southern California.
Right.
But I mean, knowing California, I don't think there's any way that our state will easily give them a right of way without a lot of lawsuits. So, you know.
Right. So a long answer, but those are some of the exciting ideas. And so in Missouri, you know, we're going to be back here in June in Kansas City to give a one-year report card on this, and we hope to be able to announce then the first of the pilot programs of what we're winnowing down from these 300 ideas. But that gives you some kind of an idea. So that wave of technology that's coming, that's what I see when I look at that. I see all those things in that bucket, those buckets coming at us.
So, Nicole, what do you think of all those ideas, and what are you recommending to other cities across the United States?
I mean, so, you know, we've all heard the term, I think, before, that all politics is local, and that's especially true when it comes to transportation. So there's no one way we can say is the best way to approach all of this or think of all of this or you know, integrate this into your existing governance structure. But basically what we're trying to tell cities is to be ready to think about this, to incorporate this into your long-range plans, to invest in the infrastructure that's necessary to support all of these new technologies, and to think about how this might change all other facets of your government going forward. You know, we're in this kind of time where it seems like every component of municipal government is kind of being overtaken by the Internet of Things, and everything's connected to metrics now, and everybody's cities and towns are moving towards smart city models. You know, so that has a lot.
What's a smart city model, just to?
Well, I mean, it's this idea that data collection and data collection basically is driving your decision-making process. So, you know, maybe it's sensor systems, maybe it's speed cameras, maybe it's, data collection in other ways. You know, there's been a big debate that has nothing to do with this about body cameras on police officers. And so the question becomes, what do you do with all that data? How do you secure it? How do you use it to drive your decisions? And you know, how do you use it to be a better government? You be a better civil servant to the people you're serving.
One question I want to get into, and I think this is actually relevant for all three of you, is the question of equity in terms of transit options. And, you know, when I look at the original car and the automobile itself, I mean, actually, when you look at the history of my state, you know, my state was controlled by the railroads a century ago, and the railroads are seen as this, like, very monopolistic entity. And then when the car came out, the car was seen as this incredibly democratic tool. It was a democratic technology, and we had a governor like a century ago who was progressive, who rode around in cars to signify his independence from the railroads. But ultimately, as cars got adopted at scale, you know, they really resulted in a lot of public disinvestment in public transit, especially for lower income workers. And so, you know, when you look at self-driving cars today, I mean, even if I go around in San Francisco, you know, Uber and Lyft have definitely gotten substantially cheaper than when they started, but at the end of the day, like the lowest they can get a price on an Uber pool is maybe like $5 or $6, and the Muni is $2. That's still, for like your lowest income workers, that's still a substantial difference. So as these technologies come out, how do you think about how to make them accessible to everyone?
So uniquely, public transit agencies, KCATA, are concerned about the equity issue. In fact, we provide affordable ways to connect people in Kansas City. That's baked into our DNA. It's who we are, and every transit agency has that as their calling card. And certainly in Kansas City, one of our challenges is to effectively get people to where they need to go. And as I said before, you know, the challenge in a city like Kansas City, only 18% of jobs are effectively connected. So even though we provide this amazing service and we generated 16 million rides last year, we still are not getting people to the jobs, to the places that they need. So our board, the vision of the entity, was really to take a more multimodal approach. Can we develop and deploy new technologies and ways of moving that can help people get there in an affordable way? And really, that's part of the reason to our drive to get into the partnership with Bridge to experiment with that idea. Is there a way that the public agency can get with the private entity and deploy a system across Kansas City that is affordable and effective to connect people to those opportunities? So I think what will be exciting about this pilot, this one-year pilot we're entering into, is we're going to be able to experiment with that in Kansas City. Is there a way that we can use technology in a different way of movement to effectively reach a broad spectrum of Kansas Cityans across the economic spectrum? And I think the opportunity is great. I think it's the absolute right role for public entities to get into the space with private partners to figure this out. I firmly believe that, you know, if it's done right, not only can it be something that's affordable for the rider, but it actually may be an affordable way for the public agency to deploy in certain circumstances. This may be more affordable than traditional ways of deploying transit. So I think there's a real opportunity here to understand that partnership in a way that may be beneficial.
Can I ask, what's the price point going to be for someone using this Bridge pilot?
So the Bridge pilot, first of all, just to get everybody excited, it's an app-based system, so we'd love to have you try it. Your first 10 rides will be at no charge, which is pretty typical in their model to begin with. But we've made a conscious decision to say that during the pilot period, we're starting out at $1.50 a ride away, which is what we're asking riders to pay on all the rest of our system. We've just created an equity in our ridership, our fares.
Does it have a planned route, or is it, I mean, like Bill said it was on demand, so I don't know if that, is it a planned route, or do you call it from an app, or?
So it's an app-based system that creates a virtual bus route based on demand requests. Okay. So there's general service areas that it will be available within, but you'll be able to ask for, and within a 5 to 10 minute walk from where you are, you'll be asked to go to a location. You'll be able to track your Bridge vehicle. It will pick you up with a guaranteed seat at a time certain and take you within a 5 to 10 minute walk of where you're going. Mm-hmm. It'll be available in the pilot in the morning, in the afternoon, during rush hour to begin with as we experiment with the system. And it'll be one that's available 5 days a week, Monday through Friday, to begin with. Mm-hmm. So.
And how much do you think it will ultimately cost to deploy one of these versus a standard bus?
Well, we're experimenting with that too. So we haven't done it before, and so I can't sit here and say that we know with certainty what the cost of deployment will be. But we understand from the model that Bridge has used in both Washington, D.C. and in Boston that it's substantially less an hour than a fixed route bus cost. But we'll be able to experiment with that and understand it over the course of the year to find out the efficiencies of it.
So, Chris, I wanted to return to a point that you brought up earlier, which is compact development versus sprawling development. And I mean, I kind of see this as, when I look at autonomous vehicles, I mean, it's obviously cool and futuristic, but my dystopian fear is sort of what you alluded to, which is, land use is controlled at a very local level in the United States, and at least in our region, it's very easy for people or communities to throw up their hands and say, well, it's so much easier for someone to commute 150 miles away now. We don't have to do anything to improve our infrastructure or build anything here, and it can enhance NIMBYism and sprawl. And I wonder what tools are available to kind of manage that risk.
So it's interesting when, as we have these discussions, and whenever I have these discussions, we'll talk about the idea of automated vehicles and connected vehicles and mobility as a service, and we bundle them all together as if they are exactly the same thing, but they're really different parts of a Venn diagram. And if we're really focusing on the autonomous vehicle piece, where the car does all the work for you, and you, to some extent, you could just sell your home and get a bigger vehicle and just ride around in the vehicle, and you don't need a home anymore. And that's really sort of the ultimate dystopian vision.
Well, no, I mean, I've had a lot of, I mean, I've had, you know, like, I mean, San Francisco is a very, like, people love making up stuff there, but, like, you know, I've definitely had lots of people think about what, like, I think IDEO made a video of, like, what if you had a mobile coffee shop, or what if you had a mobile retail shop that just traveled around and you could just get into it, or whatever.
And so those scare me to death, because I think they really are not, from an energy perspective, not the best solution we could have. But if we focus on the mobility as a service, and a lot of the services and things that are potentially enabled by autonomy, certainly enabled by connectivity, all of these mobility as a service things, they work so much better in an environment where there is a sufficient density of opportunities, right? I grew up in rural Iowa. Mobility as a service in rural Iowa doesn't work. I push the button and it's an hour before an Uber car will come, right? If an Uber car will ever come. But I think that these mobility as a service and all of the other services that are enabled by smart cities and all of the connectivity in the city, they work so much better when there is a density of opportunity which comes with a lot of people and a lot of businesses and a lot of services within a relatively confined area, and that the opportunities that they afford make those areas so much more desirable, at least to certain groups of people. Demographically right now, people below the age of 35, which are the future. That I think to some extent that mobility as a service, or all of the other as a services that you can imagine, are hopefully one of the biggest enablers of increasing density, but in a very livable, very desirable way.
I mean, I think the issue with Kansas City, I mean, both good and bad, I mean, it keeps your housing costs super affordable, there's land, endless affordable land around the city. So, I mean, that's a choice that this city, can make. Portland is another city that famously in the 1970s was looking at the sprawl of California and other metropolitan areas, and actively decided to have an urban growth boundary that enforced tighter, more compact development, even though they had available land around them. And that's created its kind of walkable, semi-urban character. But on the other hand, that does probably affect land values and affordability. So there's a trade-off there that people have got to decide to make.
I think one of the good things about Kansas City is even within the area where we've made big investments in infrastructure, there's still plenty of land left. So if we can figure out how to work together to maximize the investments we've already made, I think that's a great strategy, coupled with the idea that the conveniences and the opportunities that you're providing within this area are so persuasive to someone. The second thing I'll mention, I think Steve touched on it a little bit, is we're really talking about, even though it's coming fast with some of this technology, we're talking about investments that we're building for the next generation, really. And some of us were talking beforehand, I've got a 15-year-old, soon to be 16-year-old, and his desire to have a car is much less than mine. His interest in living in an urban environment with lots of opportunities and options is much more interesting to him. And I think as we think about a strategy for Kansas City, we already see some of this happening and it's starting to bubble up, but putting our investments in infrastructure and strategies that can attract, but even as important, retain our young people is extremely important. And I think it gives us a commonality of interest around economic development that allows us to really make conscious decisions, not just about what we're going to experiment with, but maybe what strategies we're going to use in a regional way to be competitive, both in attracting someone to us, but also keeping the great young people that called Midwest home. We ought to be that place that they want to stay home, and I think that opportunity exists in the right movement around investing in technology and infrastructure, and then developing regional strategies.
So I've sit on a lot of forums like this, having the same discussion about, well, demographically there is this tendency that younger people enjoy the opportunities, they like living in the cities, they want to stay living in the cities. And one of the areas that often comes up and says, well, this is great, they will continue to do that until they get married and have kids and want to move into the suburbs where there are better schools. So one thing that I like to encourage, say,
Or you could just make the schools better.
or you could just make the schools better. And so that's, I guess, the pitch that I want to make is that in order to keep the young, excited people who are moving into the center of the city in the center of the city after they get married and have kids, I think one of the best investments anyone can make is in better schools in those urban centers and livable centers. And it's ironic that, you know, that's typically not part of a transportation discussion, but that might be, you know, the single most important thing that could be done.
Yeah, actually, I think I'm seeing in our state and certainly in Kansas City, I think if you look at the priorities in this community, it would be education and transportation, because out of that becomes opportunity and quality of life. And I find those two very interrelated. And it's interesting to see politically, often the times they get pitted against one another, that to solve a transportation need, we're going to want to rob from education, and you know, we can't be doing that at all. They need to work hand in glove.
I mean, I guess I will just chime in from our experience in the Bay Area is that we're kind of like both dystopian outcomes at once. I mean, like, we have a lot of jobs and opportunity, but like, you have, on the one hand, California, like, we have immense sprawl, and we have a working class that's commuting in, you know, sometimes 3 hours or more every day. And then in our downtown core, in Oakland and San Francisco, it's just immense price appreciation, like more than 60% over the last 5 years. And I think one of the issues with the young people returning to the city's dynamic is that the nature of compact development, I mean, just the inherent nature of it is it's much harder to kind of build and scale more infrastructure for it once it's already there. And so we just kind of become this like crazy magnet for capital of all sorts around the world and in the United States, just because we're such a safe investment relative to everything else that's available in global markets. So our, like, you know, the sprawl model makes for cheap, like naturally affordable housing for workers, but and on the other hand, the dense kind of urban model is more attractive and livable, but it's so prone towards just this boom and bust cycle. And it's, you know, even though there's lots of young people I know who would personally love to stay in San Francisco or in Oakland, like at this point, a 3-bedroom, you know, anywhere in the city is like more than $2 million. So people would love to stay, but they can't afford to stay. I mean, I obviously don't necessarily think that that's the dynamic here, but like, I do think downtown areas are just prone to, you know, I think there's a lot, like I've been reading about real estate and housing construction all over the country, and like a lot of downtown cores attract luxury development simply because the land costs make it the only kind of feasible development that can happen in the downtown core. So I just look at our situation, don't know how you kind of balance both. And my concern is, like, with autonomous vehicles, you're gonna have the pressure to sprawl, but then parking lots and shopping centers will probably get turned over into housing or something else.
I want to jump in. I think, you know, one of the insights that Bill gave us today, as I look farther down the road, I think he was exactly right to say that our transportation in our rural and suburban areas will stay largely the same, I think. I think where we're going to find the real variety and variation will be in the urban areas, and that's the opportunity where we have to be creative and to have a more diverse kind of transportation system. You know, I think that's what's significant about this forum. It needs to start in our urban areas.
And I think the solutions are going to be regionally very different, right? I mean, the technologies will need to be interoperable, so they'll work in a solution that one city picks, that every city picks, but the cities may pick different solutions depending upon just the nature of the city and the land mass and the populace.
And it's very particular. So, for instance, you know, we've talked about some of the success stories we see in other cities with mass transit. You know, you look at Denver, you look at a Salt Lake City, you look at Portland. And yeah, they had good leadership, but it's interesting, you know, they benefited from the particularities of their geography. And that is, in almost every one of those instances, they faced geographical barriers that kind of hemmed in growth or allowed them to build linear lines that weren't like a spider web. You know, here in Kansas City, our challenge is that we grow in all directions, and land is fairly inexpensive. You go to Denver, and they're only a 180-degree city because they're bounded by the mountains. You know, you do that in Salt Lake City, and you know, they're bounded by the Great Salt Lake and the mountains there, and you've got the same issue in Portland. And so that actually has aided them in building systems. So every community is going to have to size up what their particular characteristics are. But one of the things, for instance, here, I mentioned before that we're the second largest rail center in the country. We have this fabulous network of rail that's either abandoned or underutilized, and I know the former Jackson County executive Mike Sanders kind of took this on as a kind of a personal mission of his, was to explore long range whether we might reuse or reposition those rail tracks to make commuter lines, so that from Lee Summit, which is a suburb here, whether you would take a commuter line someday that might take you right down into a Union Station that would connect with streetcar. I think as a community we have to look around and see the particularities of our situation. Just as I said before, on the freight side, talking about the opportunity for river. We're not going to be a Denver, we're not going to be a Salt Lake, we're a Kansas City, and we have our own unique opportunities that we need to dig in, explore, and maximize.
Do you see, I mean, like Bill said, he said, a lot of these new technologies are essentially, they don't have the density to be viable in rural and suburban areas, but do you see any opportunity to rethink or reimagine what the first ring suburbs could be? Because they're right near the downtown core, where you could have density, enough density to have lots of availability of services, but they're still kind of on, one house per lot, curvy roads. Like how I feel like there's a lot of opportunity to rethink what that could be.
Part of the bridge experiment will be into some of those first ring suburb type areas to understand if there's a way to use, a variation of rideshare to encourage people to move in a different way. So I think there's a huge opportunity there, and as you take a look at investments and looking at those inner ring suburbs, making them more connected. I mean, there's plenty of young people that are in those inner ring suburbs today that we've talked to at KCATA that would love to go to one car instead of two. Yep. And so if you can offer them the opportunity to move in a different way that's an effective and efficient way, as part of a system, by the way. So the way we deploy bridge in this public-private partnership is that you then have access to all the other modes. So whether it's streetcar as you get to downtown, which will be coming online here, or the existing bus system, or bike ped at KCATA, the idea is to connect people all the way together with those. So perhaps bridge is the entree in to a greater system the closer you get into the core city. We think there's a huge opportunity for that, to take advantage of that in the first ring suburbs area.
And one thing that we're blessed with, I think, here is, Joe talked about the importance of collaboration. Again, one of the challenges we face is we're a bi-state community. We have about equal population on both sides. We have multiple counties. And, so that makes sometimes collaboration difficult. But we've been pretty blessed with, I think, having, good leadership from our chamber and our civic council, and then Mid-America Regional Council, which is our metropolitan planning organization, handling not just transportation, but all these livability issues that we've talked about, the ability to sit down and look at this kind of long-range visionary planning and then implement it. It's going to be critical, and it's going to be critical that we continue to update that as we see how innovation is going to open and close opportunities for the community going forward.
If I could just say one thing about that, Steve, I think you bring up a good point. I think we're our own worst enemies about cooperation in Kansas City. We do cooperate with one another. We do collaborate with one another, and we really need to make a conscious effort to talk in those terms within Kansas City, because I think it's one of our huge advantages. And while we have all the jurisdictional boundaries and we all know what they are, the fact of the matter is I'm in more situations and in more meetings where people from all over this region are trying to figure things out working together than ever before. And I think it's a huge advantage for us. I think we need to frame our thinking and our dialogue around this to talk in those terms, because the opportunities are waiting for us to get together and collaborate in those ways. Certainly around transportation, maybe in a way that is generational in Kansas City. There's a way for us to collaborate throughout this region to move our economy forward, quite frankly, in a unique Kansas City way, I agree, by getting together and collaborating. So I think it's a strategic advantage for us. And I think we are already there as individuals and collectively. We're already having those dialogues and those commitments to one another. And I think it's just waiting to be set on fire. And really the opportunities around transportation is really one of those places.
Well, thank you so much. We're about to run out of time, so I just wanted to, again, offer a lightning round if you had any last thoughts or kind of lessons for the audience that you wanted to share.
Well, sure, I'll just build on what you just said. I think cities are the ultimate collaborators, so to speak, because of the way they're embedded in other levels of government and placed directly in the midst of the community. So certainly in looking at all of these potential partnerships, I think that's something that cities need to be considering as they're trying to broach all these subjects.
You know, when I talk about transportation, I say that in many respects we have solved many of the technological and building and engineering problems that we have. And our greatest problems now are maybe the more difficult ones, and that is, you know, how do we fight apathy, parochialism, and fragmentation? How do we, as a nation or as a state or as a community, mobilize in a way, so as I said, using my analogy before, that if we're waiting for that wave, that we're starting to paddle together to be ready for that wave rather than standing pat. And that is what I spend a lot of my time as a highway commissioner doing, is going around the state trying to educate people. And it's a tough lift, but our success will be based upon all of us doing our part to mobilize. And the great challenge for us going forward will be how we find the money. Where are the new creative ways, the new creative business models? That's really where the innovation has got to come. We get the technology, and that's going to take care of itself. But how we find the ability to invest through creative means and mobilize as a society will be our great challenge.
I'm particularly excited about Kansas City right now. And I think that we're a region that's known for transportation and logistics. We always have been. It's baked into us. It's who we are. And I think we need to take that niche and exploit it fully to the benefit of Kansas City. And if we look at mobility, an emerging different way of moving people that's technology-based, we can become the place where, through collaboration and cooperation, where that tech comes to work, that it's the place where we can deliver the platform to merge technology and transportation and movement in a very unique way. And I think it fully exploits a lot of our advantages across Kansas City if we're able to do that.
I guess I'll take a second to be completely self-serving and go back to your really great idea of having the energy and the information and everything flowing down the highway. If you build a highway with electric vehicle charging infrastructure built into it, I want to come do research on it. So.
Fair enough, you're invited.
All right, well, thank you all so much, and thank you for sitting through this for the last afternoon. So I just want to make sure that you know that you're all invited to the next Kinetic event, which will be on April 22nd. The exact time and location is yet to be announced, but the keynote presenter will be Rosabeth Moss-Kanner, who's the author of a book titled Move, which is about putting America's infrastructure back in the lead. So be sure to save that date. And there's a second related event, which is KC Smartport's annual industry briefing, and that is on April 6th. And the details of that are on the back of your program. Thank you all so much for coming. Hope to see you again soon.